Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
Formerly on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World.
Unicorns are commonly understood to be horses that have a single horn emerging from their forehead. Today, they are a prominent part of pop culture. They appear in illustrations, many of them for children. They feature in books and cartoons and appear as costumes. They're often associated with rainbows and other emblems of cuteness. Some even say that unicorns poop rainbows, and they're associated with the New Age movement and other social movements. But despite their popularity today, unicorns have deep roots in the past, including a long association with the Christian faith. And modern ideas about unicorns are very different from those of the past. So, what are unicorns? What did people believe about them? And could there be actual real unicorns? So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be looking at the mysteries that we set up this week, including what could be behind the cave painting of the unicorns, what could be behind the ancient carvings of bull-like unicorns, what could be behind the reports of goat-like unicorns, what could be behind the Bible's mention of unicorns, what could be behind the reports of Roman authors like Pliny the Elder, what could be behind the story of virgins taming unicorns, and what could be behind the alicorns or unicorn horns that appeared in Europe.
You're listening to episode 317 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're discussing the truth about unicorns. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Last week, we told you about the history of unicorns. We saw that people in prior centuries were serious about unicorns existing. And we saw how their ideas about unicorns were very different than today's pop culture ideas. For one thing, many ancient unicorns were not supposed to be like horses. Instead, they were said to be like animals such as bulls, goats, donkeys, and others. People in the past in Europe even had physical proof of unicorns, such as the extremely valuable alicorns or unicorn horns that were held by royal houses. But after the scientific revolution began, the towering French biologist Georges Cuvier argued that unicorns were physically impossible, and his argument convinced many. But as we heard at the very end of last week's episode, Cuvier was proved wrong. Not only can unicorns exist, they have existed, and they do exist. So what formed the basis of all the historical unicorn accounts? What did the ancients get right and wrong about them, and what does the future hold for unicorns? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, how do you want to proceed with today's episode?
Basically, by walking through the mysteries we discussed last week in chronological order. We began with apparent references to unicorns in cave art. Then we moved forward into accounts of unicorns after the invention of writing, and we took things up to the scientific revolution and Georges Cuvier's argument that unicorns can't exist. So we're going to start with the Stone Age and walk forward in time, and we're going to see why Cuvier was wrong remarkably early in that sequence.
Before we do that, let's look at unicorns briefly from the faith perspective. What is there to say about them?
Not a lot. As we covered last episode, Christians prior to the scientific revolution in the 1600s saw theological meanings in all kinds of animals, including unicorns, which they commonly saw as a symbol of Jesus Christ, although Pope Gregory the Great thought they were a symbol of the Jewish people. I find these symbolic, allegorical, theological interpretations interesting, and in fact, all created beings do reflect aspects of their creator. So if you want to, you can look at God's creatures and infer things about God and see symbols of God in them. If you do that, though, you need to make sure that the symbol you're proposing is based on an actual fact about the animals. For example, if virgins can't, in real life, actually tame unicorns, then you shouldn't be drawing lessons about Christ and the Virgin Mary about them from that basis. However, more fundamentally, none of the speculative religious interpretations of unicorns that patristic and medieval Christians gave are matters of church teaching. They're all just speculative theological opinions, so we won't really be covering them here further. Instead, we'll be looking at unicorns from the reason perspective, which will look at unicorns as non-supernatural creatures, as just animals, which is actually what all the writers we heard from last week thought they were, rare but perfectly natural animals rather than paranormal creatures.
Then let's turn to the reason perspective. What could be behind the cave paintings of unicorns?
You'll recall from last week that we looked at several pieces of cave art, such as those from Lascaux Cave, that some have thought contained images of unicorns, but that does not appear to be the case. However, we also saw one piece of art from Rouffignac Cave that dates to about 11,000 BC in the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age. And this one shows the outline of a creature that does have a single curved horn. Well, it turns out that there is a plausible candidate for a known animal that could have inspired this image. The animal is known as the elasmotherium, and it doesn't exist today. It's extinct. Based on the remains that we found, though, elasmotheriums were very large, powerful animals. They were comparable in size to elephants. They grew up to at least 16 feet long from snout to rump, maybe longer. They were 8 feet tall at the shoulder, and they weighed up to 5 tons. There were a lot of them in Siberia, and because of that, they are sometimes called the Siberian unicorn. Because they grew up in a cold climate during the Ice Age, it's assumed that they were covered in wool, like woolly mammoths and other creatures of that time and place. And scientists believe that they had a central horn on their snout, though, oddly, we've never found one of the horns. So we're not exactly sure what form the horn took. Nevertheless, it would have been really impressive as a puny human to encounter one of these mighty creatures. So it's not surprising that early humans were impressed by them and drew them on cave walls, assuming that the identification of the Rouffignac cave painting with an elasmotherium is correct.
Let me pose an objection that some have made to that identification. The cave painting goes back to around 11,000 BC, but didn't elasmotherium go extinct long before that?
This used to be a serious challenge to the identification. While it's always possible that early humans in France found the bones of elasmotherium and based the cave painting on the bones, this is not very likely. And for a long time, it was assumed that elasmotheriums went extinct about 350,000 years ago, long before the cave painting was made. However, in 2016, it was announced that a new elasmotherium skull had been discovered in Kazakhstan, and radiocarbon dating indicated that the skull dated to only about 29,000 BC. This meant that elasmotherium definitely survived for more than 300,000 years longer than had previously been thought, and that brought it into contact with early humans in the area. Furthermore, we now know that the species survived until at least 29,000 BC, and it's quite plausible that some individuals managed to survive to 11,000 BC when the cave painting was made. It still doesn't prove that the cave artist was depicted in elasmotherium, but it's at least plausible that he did so. In any event, the elasmotherium or Siberian unicorn was a unicorn-like beast that came into contact with early humans.
Let's move forward in time now to the Indus Valley civilization, which existed between 3300 BC and 1300 BC. Last week, we noted that even though we can't read their writing, the Indus Valley residents had many images of what appeared to be unicorns. In this case, they look like bulls with a single horn coming from their foreheads, and these are particularly common on the personal seals that they would use to seal documents in their civilization. What could be behind the ancient carvings of bull-like unicorns?
Here's where things get interesting. First, I want to touch back on a question we mentioned last week. How do we know that these inscriptions aren't just showing us a cow or bull from the side in profile, so that it really has two horns like normal, but the near horn is blocking the far horn, making it look like a single horn? Last week, we mentioned that these images aren't complete profiles, and the Indus Valley people showed these bulls with 4 legs, even though the animal only had 1 horn. They also had other images where they showed a normal ox or cow that clearly has 2 horns. But in various unicorn images, the bull is shown with a horn seemingly projecting from the center of its forehead in a way that doesn't look natural for the side-on depiction of a cow's horn. So it really does look like they're depicting a unicorn version of an ox or bull.
But Georges Cuvier had an argument that unicorns of this type of animal couldn't exist. Like horses and goats and donkeys and other animals, cattle have a central fissure running down the middle of their skull's forehead. But in all his research, Cuvier never found an animal with a horn growing out of the split bones of a forehead. It's hard to see how a horn could grow out of a joined surface like that. So he argued that unicorns, or at least for this type of animal, looked impossible.
Correct, but as we noted at the end of last week's episode, Cuvier was wrong about this. In his book, The Natural History of Unicorns, Chris Lavers explains,
in the 1820s, Georges Cuvier promoted the theory that the horn cores of animals like cows and goats grow from their owners' skulls. Cuvier's view became orthodoxy for lack of any obvious alternative, while his unrivaled reputation as a zoologist ensured that it stayed that way. But W. Franklin Dove, a biologist at the University of Maine in the 1930s, showed that his eminent predecessor had been wrong. Cuvier, like all his contemporaries, Dove wrote in 1936, was mistaken in his idea of horn structure. I have reported recently that the bony horn cores of ruminants, Bos taurus and Capra domestica, are not outgrowths of the skull frontal bones, as comparative anatomists have generally considered them to be, but are rather the products of separate ossification centers in tissues above the frontal bones. In other words, Dove showed that horns grow not from the skull, but from separate centers of bone formation floating in an animal's flesh. From these, horn buds sprout bony cores which only later fuse to the skeleton underneath. It was because of his ideas about horn growth that Cuvier thought that unicorns could not exist. To be centrally placed on the forehead, a unicorn's horn would have to grow from the junction between the frontal bones of the skull, and since Cuvier had never seen a horn growing from the junction between two of an animal's bones, he concluded that such a thing could not happen. He was correct in that horn cores do not grow from the edges of skull bones, but Dove showed that they do not grow from anywhere else on the skull either. Dove also knew of some obscure references to animal husbandry techniques which suggested that the horns of domestic animals could be altered in various ways. Le Vaillant, 1796, in his Travels in Africa, Dove writes, describes a process of manipulating the horns of oxen. As the horns of the young ox sprout, they are trained over the forehead until the points meet. They are then manipulated so as to make them coalesce and so shoot upwards from the middle of the forehead, like the horn of the fabled unicorn.
So Cuvier was wrong that horns grow directly from the animal's skull. Instead, they grow out of little horn buds that are part of the flesh of the animal's forehead, and they only join to the skulls after they grow. As a result, you can catch the horns when they're still at a very early stage of development. You can adjust the newly forming horns so that you train the horn buds to move towards the center of the skull, and you can then knit the two developing horns together so that the animal ends up with a single horn growing from the middle of its forehead. In fact, you can manipulate horns to grow in other ways too. Lavers quotes the 19th century author J.G. Wood explaining,
in some parts of the African country, the native herdsman lavishes his powers on the horns. Among us, the horn does not seem capable of such modification, but a Kafir, skillful in his art, can never be content to leave the horns as they are. He will cause one to project forward, another backward, and he will train one to grow upright and the other pointing to the ground. Sometimes he observes a kind of symmetry, and has both horns bent with their points nearly touching the shoulders, or trains them so that their tips meet above, and they form an arch over the head.
Lavers also quotes the 18th century author Le Vaillant, who wrote,
being at this time persuaded that these horns, of which I had no idea were a peculiar present of nature, I considered the Kafir oxen as a variety of the species. But I was undeceived by my guide, who informed me that this singularity was only the effect of their invention and taste, and that by means of a process with which they were well acquainted, they could not only multiply these horns, but also give them any form that their imaginations might suggest. They take the animal at as tender an age as possible, and when the horns begin to appear, they make small vertical incision in them with a saw, or any other instrument that may be substituted for it, and divide them into two parts. This division makes the horns, yet tender, separate of themselves, so that in time the animal has 4 very distinct ones. If they wish to have 6, or even more, similar notches made with the saw produce as many as may be required.
So by the art of horn manipulation, you can end up with an animal that has 1 central horn if you want a unicorn, or you can give it 4, 6, or 8 horns if you want. You can make the horns grow upward to the sky or down to the ground. You can make them form an arch on the animal's head. You can basically do anything you want. And this wasn't done just in Africa. It was also done in other parts of the world, including up in Nepal, just north of India. And it was even known to the Romans. The 1st century author, Pliny the Elder, who died in the Mount Vesuvius eruption, as we discussed last week, even wrote about it, saying,
"The substance of horn is so ductile that even the horns of living cattle can be bent with boiling wax, and they can be slit at birth and twisted in opposite directions, so as to produce 4 horns on one head." Natural History, 1145, 127.
Now, one of the animals this works for is Bos taurus, or common cattle. After Franklin Dove figured all this out in the 1930s, he decided to test the accounts he'd heard about, and so he decided to make a unicorn bull, or unibull, as it's been called. Lavers explains,
In March 1933, Dove set about creating a unicorn. He acquired a day-old Ayrshire bull and performed a delicate operation on its forehead. He cut out the calves' horn buds while leaving them attached to strips of skin, ensuring that they stayed alive. He then planted the buds one on top of the other into a pre-prepared area in the center of the calf's forehead, above and in contact with the suture between the frontal bones of the skull. Dove included a photograph of the calf in his 1936 article.
And we'll have a picture of Dr. Dove's unibull in the video version of this episode. But that's the likely explanation for the unicorn oxen that we see in the seals of the Indus Valley civilization. They really did have unicorn cattle in ancient India. Furthermore, when you use this procedure on an animal, it affects not only its physiological development, it also affects its psychological development and its position within its herd or flock. And this explains why we'd find unicorn oxen on the seals that were used by upper-class wealthy people in the Indus Valley. You see, we have a number of indications that unicorn animals were considered particularly valuable in the ancient world. That could be partly due to the fact that you had to take extra efforts to make them one-horned, and so they were more valued because of the extra effort. But we also have associations between their one-hornedness and leadership, with unicorns seeming to be the leaders of their flocks or herds. Now, why would that be? Franklin Dove wrote,
The unicorn is conscious of peculiar power. Although he is an animal with the hereditary potentiality for 2 horns, he recognizes the power of a single horn, which he uses as a prow to pass under fences and barriers in his path, or as a forward-thrusting bayonet in his attacks. According to our literature, an aristocratic manner is inherent in every unicorn. He is always the leader, quite rightly so. Any animal fronted with a single horn could learn the advantages of a single well-placed weapon and would, through experience, gain ascendance and leadership over the rest of the herd.
Lavers goes on to explain,
As Dove points out, strange as it may seem, hornless cattle often dominate their horned neighbors. Hornless cattle butt their rivals or threaten to do so with their full body weight, rather than displaying, locking horns, head-bucking, and side-slashing in the traditional shows of bluster and strength that usually decide who is who in a dominance hierarchy. Dove was convinced that his unicorn was conscious of a similar peculiar power. Instead of lowering its head to the ground, the unicorned animal can stand erect and aim its horn right between its opponent's eyes. The threat that such a beast would pose to its fellows might be enough to settle disputes before they begin. For a truly dominant individual rarely has to lower itself to violence. The one-horned animal receives deference from its fellows, while the herdsman describes the leader of his herd in terms destined to echo down the ages: powerful, gentle, noble, aristocratic.
So yeah, if you have a single horn in the middle of your forehead, you don't have to use the sides of your head for an attack. You don't have to swish your head back and forth, and your opponent can't block you by locking horns with you. You can just ram him straight on with your one central horn, and there isn't much he can do about it. So horn manipulation unicorns would tend to become dominant animals in their groups. They tend to be the natural leaders, which makes them even more valuable in human eyes. And that, coupled with the extra investment of labor in making them, would be why rich people in the Indus Valley would use them so commonly on their personal seals. They're saying, in essence, I'm so big and powerful that I'm like a human unicorn. I'm a leader of men, the same way unicorns are leaders of their herds. We also have records from some cultures of artificial unicorns being given as gifts to royalty or to the gods in sacrifice, since you want to give really good gifts to your rulers, earthly or heavenly.
Last week, we heard some historic accounts of unicorns that were like goats rather than horses or cows. Could the horn manipulation technique have been what was responsible for some of these reports of goat-like unicorns?
It's certainly possible. One of the species that Dove said in 1936 had horns that grow from buds was Capra domestica, that is, the domestic goat. So you could do the same thing with plain old regular goats. And in fact, it has been done by an American named Oberon Zell, who became very interested in making unicorns in the 1970s and 80s. Here's a brief biography of him from historyofyesterday.com.
From 1961 through 1965, he attended Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, concentrating in psychology, sociology, anthropology, and pre-med. He continued his education at Washington University in St. Louis, where he received a USPHS scholarship in clinical psych. He then finished a DD program at Life Science College, a small Christian seminary in Rolling Meadows, Illinois. He graduated from Harris Teachers College in St. Louis with a teaching certificate. Zell worked for the Human Development Corps in the War on Poverty for many years as a counselor, social psychologist, and program supervisor, as well as teaching in public schools. His obsession with unicorns started in the 1970s with the fantasy novel by Peter S. Beagle, The Last Unicorn. The ideology that unicorns once roamed our Earth and they have ended up extinct due to various reasons is a thought that would not leave him to live in peace.
So, drawing on the work of Franklin Dove, Zell came up with a new and improved surgical technique to make unicorns, and he made them using goats. His most famous unigoat was named Lancelot, who was, very clearly, a goat with one prominent horn. Lancelot was so impressive that the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus had Lancelot touring with them for some time. In 1984, Zell took out a patent on his surgical technique for making unicorns, and we'll have a link to it so you can read it for yourself. You can even use the technique if you want to, because the patent reportedly expired in 2001. And so anybody should be able to use it to make unicorns today, local animal welfare laws permitting. In fact, some people have been using either this technique or one similar to it. There's a channel on YouTube called The Unicorn Keepers, and they only have 3 short videos, but they've got a flock of goats that includes multiple unigoats. Here's a short clip. It's only about 30 seconds long of a keeper interacting with several of her unigoats. We'll also have a link to the video for listeners of the audio version of the podcast. And I like how at the end of the video, you can see one of the unigoats putting his horn to practical use, bending its head backwards and using the single horn to scratch its own back.
Hello, Aoife. No, get down. Go on, Aoife.
So yes, the horn manipulation technique could have been used to produce animals that became the basis for the historic reports of goat-like unicorns. But there's much more to cover when it comes to the truth about unicorns.
And before we get to that, we'd like to take a moment now to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Thomas V., Jody F., Brian S., Bob L., and Leonidas S. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. Now, let's talk about something that should be of particular interest to religious listeners, unicorns in the Bible. Last week you said that the issue of unicorns in the Bible is a bit tricky. Why did you say that?
Because it depends on the translation you're using. In some versions, there are like 8 passages that mention unicorns, and they're all in the Old Testament. They appear in the books of Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Psalms, and Job, and we read these 8 passages last week. Now, most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and these particular books were written in Hebrew. The Hebrew word that is used in these passages is ra'em. But when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, beginning a couple of centuries before Christ, a version known as the Septuagint, it translated ra'em using the Greek word monokeros. And that Greek word unambiguously means unicorn. Monos is Greek for only, isolated, or one, and keros means horn. So a monokeros means one horn. That's why later Latin translations translated these passages with the equivalent Latin term unicornus, which also means one horn. And then some later translations into other languages, like the Vulgate, the Catholic Douay-Rheims Bible, and the Protestant King James Bible, also used the term unicorn in English.
Skeptics sometimes mock the Bible for mentioning unicorns. What do you make of that attitude?
I understand why they do it. People today don't believe in unicorns. They think of them as fantasy creatures, and so that makes it easy for skeptics to mock the Bible for mentioning creatures that people today don't believe in. But if you're a fair-minded person, in order to make this mockery really stick, you really need to do 2 things. First, you need to show that the Bible is literally asserting that unicorns exist, that they're not just being used figuratively. And that's going to be hard because none of the 8 unicorn passages has a unicorn appearing on camera, as it were. You never read a statement like, then Moses hopped on his unicorn and rode off. Instead, all the references to unicorns are in literary comparisons in poetry, which creates the possibility that they're being used in a non-literal way. Just like I could say, oh, my former boss was such an ogre, without believing that ogres really exist. However, secondly, and more importantly, you need to show that this isn't a translation issue. No translation is perfect, and if you want to criticize the Septuagint, the Vulgate, the Douay-Rheims, or the King James Version for using unicorn in these passages, you can. In fact, modern translations of the Bible tend not to use the word unicorn. What you'd need to do is show that the criticism applies not to translations of the Bible, but to the original version of the books, the ones the translations are made from. That means you'd need to show that the Hebrew word ra'em means unicorn. And that's where this criticism falls flat, because if you look in a Hebrew dictionary, you won't find the meaning unicorn listed for ra'em. Instead, you'll find that ra'em means things like wild bull, wild ox, and auroch. Auroch, or Bos primigenius, being an extinct species of very large cattle, and they were really huge. Unlike domestic cattle, a male auroch could stand as tall as a human being, so its shoulder would be at the height of your head. And it's estimated that aurochs may have weighed up to 3,000 pounds, or 1.5 tons. As the Latin name primigenius suggests aurochs were the ancestors of modern domesticated cattle, and aurochs were eventually driven into extinction in the AD 1600s, but they were still around in the first millennium BC when the Hebrew Old Testament were written, even if they were getting rarer. Incidentally, there are efforts to bring aurochs back today, not through cloning, at least not yet, but through a technique known as backbreeding, which involves selectively breeding modern animals to be as much like their ancestors as possible. And these neo-aurochs have been reintroduced into the wild in Europe. We'll have a link to an article so that you can read about that.
Have any scholars proposed any other creatures besides the auroch or other forms of cattle for what the biblical authors may be referring to?
There have been some suggestions. For example, in Psalm 92:10, the psalmist says, "My horn will be raised up as a unicorn." And some have thought that that must mean that unicorns have really tall horns. So they started thinking about cow-like animals that had really tall horns. And they thought of a species known as the Arabian oryx. That's oryx, not auroch. And the Arabian oryx is a kind of antelope or gazelle that does have really tall horns. Its horns can grow up to 4 feet long, and they're quite tall and straight and stick almost straight up from its head. So they are tall, impressive horns. And if you focus only on Psalm 92:10, you might propose the Arabian oryx as what the Hebrew authors were referring to when they refer to a ra'am. Also, oryxes have horns made of hollow bone, and if one of them snaps due to an injury, it won't regrow. Consequently, you do sometimes see oryxes that have only one horn, so that could explain why oryxes were linked to unicorns.
What do you make of that proposal?
I find it interesting, but I'm not persuaded. One reason is that oryx that lose a horn are going to be in the minority. So the biblical authors would think of most oryxes as having 2 horns. Also, if an oryx does lose a horn, then its remaining horn will point off its head at an angle, so it will look unnatural, like an injured animal, rather than one that is naturally one-horned. And all of this is relying on Psalm 92's reference to a monoceros having an exalted or high-up horn. But other animals have big, impressive horns, and there are passages that suggest the horn of the ra'am can do significant damage, like Deuteronomy 33:17, which says that Jacob's horns are like those of a ra'am, and with them he will gore the nations and push them as far as the ends of the earth. Or Psalm 22:21, where the psalmist asked to be saved from the horns of the ra'am. Both of these passages indicate that a ra'am can do significant damage with its horns in combat. But when you look at an oryx, it's clear that their horns aren't built for that. They're built for ritual display and maybe some headbutting. But they're so tall that the oryx can't effectively gore or impale an opponent with them. And they're so long and fragile that they're not good for pushing an opponent away. By contrast, the horns of an auroch, being like those of a cow, you can easily imagine how a cow-like beast could push its opponents away with its horns, or gore or impale them without the horns snapping off. Finally, there are comparisons in the Bible between the ra'am and domestic animals, like where the author of Job asks whether the ra'am will serve you, whether it will lie down by your trough, and whether it will pull a plow through the earth for you. All of that suggests the ra'am is like a bigger, more powerful, more wild version of a domestic animal like a cow, rather than a tall-horned version of an antelope or gazelle. And so, with most modern Bible translators, I think the balance of evidence points away from the Arabian oryx and towards the ancestor of modern cattle, the auroch, or to some kind of large, non-domesticated bull-ox-cow animal.
Then how did monoceros, or unicorn, end up in the Greek Septuagint?
Probably because the Greek-speaking translators weren't sure what ra'am meant. Suppose that it had originally been used to refer to aurochs. Well, They were in a long, slow process of going extinct, so they weren't that common, and the translators didn't know exactly what the term meant. They thus tried to figure out what a ra'em was based on clues in the context. Last episode, I gave the following as what we could deduce about the animals under discussion from the 8 passages where they're named. It's a remarkable beast that's famed for its splendor, as we heard twice in the book of Numbers. Unicorns have prominent and powerful horns, as depicted in Deuteronomy and Psalm 22. Unicorns are apparently strong, for God built his sanctuary like one in Psalm 78. And in Psalm 92, the psalmist says that his strength, or horn, will be like that of a unicorn. Finally, in Job, we learned that unicorns are not domesticated, they will not serve man, they will not lie down by farmyard troughs, they will not be tied up, they will not pull plows, and they will not bring seed to the threshing floor, but they are very strong. Now, in these passages, we are not told what conventional animal the unicorn most closely resembles, but we have bulls mentioned in Deuteronomy and Psalm 29. The passage in Job says that unicorns won't do the kind of work that bulls are used for. We also have a juxtaposition with a lion, another strong animal, in Psalm 22, but the repeated references to bulls suggest this is some kind of ox-like or cow-like animal, except it isn't the same as a domesticated bull, because the domesticated ones are mentioned alongside the ra'em in Deuteronomy and Psalm 29. So the ra'em can't be the same thing as domesticated cattle. Therefore, the Septuagint translators tried to think up something else that was a big, impressive, strong, non-domesticated horned animal, and based on the cultural knowledge they had from other ancient authors like the ones we heard about last week, they came up with the monokeros, or unicorn.
Why would they assume it had only one horn, though, instead of the usual 2?
Quite possibly because of the reference to the ra'em in Psalm 92. Hebrew poets use horns as symbols for strength, and in Psalm 92:10, the psalmist is talking about how God will bless him, and he says, "My horn," meaning my strength, "will be raised up as a ra'em." It says, "my horn," singular, so that the translators may have assumed that a ra'em has only one horn, in which case monokeros would be a reasonable Greek translation. Unfortunately, if that was their reasoning, then they missed a couple of other references that go the other way. In Deuteronomy 33:17, Moses is comparing the tribe of Joseph to a firstling bull, and he says his horns are the horns of a ra'em, meaning they're big and powerful horns. But in Hebrew, the words for horn here are not singular. Instead, in both cases, his horns, and in his horns and in the horns of a ra'em, horns is in the dual number. Hebrew grammar is a bit different than English grammar on this point. In English, we have the singular number to refer to one of something, like rabbit, and the plural number to refer to more than one of something, like rabbits. But in Hebrew, they also have the dual number, which is used for things that you naturally have 2 of. You'd use the dual number to refer to things that come in pairs, like 2 eyes, 2 ears, or 2 horns. By using the dual number for the horns of a ra'em, Deuteronomy 33:17 tells us that a ra'em has 2 horns. The same thing is indicated in Psalm 22. In Psalm 22:21, the psalmist prays to be rescued from the horns of the ra'em, and once again, the word for horns is in the dual number, again telling us that ra'em has 2 horns. So the Septuagint translators were mistaken in thinking that monokeros or unicorn was a good translation of ra'em. By using the dual number for its horns, the Hebrew text clearly indicates that this animal has 2 horns, and coupled with other things we're told about it, including the comparisons with domesticated cattle, modern Hebrew scholars have correctly concluded that the ra'em is either the auroch or some other kind of large non-domesticated bull. So the Hebrew Bible does not contain any references to unicorn. It's only some later translations that have made this mistake.
All right, let's move forward in history now to later authors that refer to unicorns. One of them was the Roman author, Pliny the Elder. He reported that the unicorn was an animal native to India, and he gave a detailed description of it. What could he have been referring to?
To answer that question, we need to refresh our memory of what Pliny said. So here's his description once again.
The Orsayan Indians hunt down a very fierce animal called the monoceros, which has the head of the stag, the feet of the elephant, and the tail of the boar, while the rest of the body is like that of the horse. It makes a deep lowing noise and has a single black horn, which projects from the middle of its forehead 2 cubits in length. The animal, it is said, cannot be taken alive. Natural History, 831.
By comparing the different body parts of the creature to those of other animals, Pliny allows us to build up a more detailed mental picture of it. And there have been modern artists who have been able to put together images of Pliny's unicorn. We use one such image in this episode's artwork, and you can see how the body parts in the illustration do match Pliny's description. The head is like that of a stag or male deer. The feet are like those of an elephant, the tail is like that of a boar, and the body is like that of a horse, and it also has a single horn in the middle of its forehead. However, back in episode 284 on the Question Beast, we learned that we need to read multi-animal body part descriptions like this with some care. We shouldn't take them too exactly because they're attempts to describe what a creature's body parts are similar to, but not identical to. So we need to allow the descriptions to have some play. Doing that allowed us to identify the Arthurian Question Beast and what it was in real life. I won't spoil that here, but you can go and listen to mysterious.fm/284 if you'd like to find out.
So, is there an animal native to India that fits Pliny's description?
There is, and I'll tell you what it is. The Indian rhinoceros. To get this, think about what an Indian rhino looks like. Unlike the African rhino, the Indian rhino has only one horn. So the Indian rhino is a true unicorn. In fact, that's even its scientific name, which is Rhinoceros unicornus. In Greek, rhinos means nose or snout, keros means horn. Meanwhile, over in Latin, uni means one and cornu means horn. So a Rhinoceros unicornus is a one-horned nose horn. Even its scientific name includes unicorn. Now, think about the different parts of an Indian rhino's body and how they compare to Pliny's description. He says its head is like that of a stag, and it is. He says that its feet are like those of an elephant, and they are. He says its tail is like that of a boar, and it is. And he says its body is like that of a horse, and again it is, which is not surprising because horses and rhinos are related. They're both perissodactyls, or ungulates with an odd number of toes, even though rhinos are bulkier and the proportions are different. But you can see how, if you give the body parts in Pliny's description of the unicorn some play, they basically match the body parts of an Indian rhino.
What about the horn? Pliny says the unicorn's horn is in the middle of its forehead, but a rhino's horn is down near its nose. How do you explain that?
Well, in the first place, Pliny didn't visit India, not so far as I know, so this may have simply been a mistake on his part. However, also, the rhino's horn is centered in a left to right sense. It doesn't lean to the left or to the right. So it is in the middle. The real question is whether you can describe it as being in the rhino's forehead, but that depends on what you count as a forehead. We humans have front-mounted eyes, and our nose starts between them. So our forehead is above that. But Pliny says that the unicorn's head is like the head of a stag, and stags have side-mounted eyes with a much longer forehead and their nose being down at the bottom. Consequently, stags can be understood as having much longer foreheads than humans do, and if we use this understanding of what counts as a forehead, it's easy to see how a rhinoceros's horn can be understood as being part of its forehead. Given this understanding of what counts as a forehead for animals with side-mounted eyes, We can thus understand the rhino as having a nose in the forehead and in the middle of a forehead from a left-right perspective. On the other hand, at this point, we are arguing about small details and proportions. As I said, Pliny didn't visit India as far as I know. He didn't see an Indian rhinoceros as far as I know. And so we should look at the similarities of an Indian rhinoceros and the beast he describes, and I conclude that it's a very likely candidate for it. And incidentally, Pliny also says that the Indian unicorn makes a deep lowing noise. And just like in episode 284 on the Question Beast, now that we know what real-life animal the Indian unicorn is, I can let you listen to what this noise sounds like. It sounds like this. Or at least that's one of the rhinoceros vocalizations that's a plausible candidate. In any event, there's basically no doubt that Pliny is talking here about the Indian rhinoceros and that this animal is the basis of many of the ancient accounts of Indian unicorns, which is what scholars have overwhelmingly concluded. In fact, this is not a new idea. It was known in the Middle Ages. Actually, as I mentioned last week, I suppressed one word in a quotation from Pope St. Gregory the Great in order to avoid a spoiler. We quoted Pope Gregory as saying,
"This creature, which is called also the monarcheros in Greek copies, is said to be of such great strength as not to be taken by any skill of hunters." Morals in Job, 6:31-15-29.
Except in the translation I had, it didn't say this creature. It said this rhinoceros. And that wasn't just in the translation. I looked it up in the Latin original, and it used the word rhinoceros in Latin. But I didn't want to spoil where we were headed, so I put the word creature in brackets in the quotation we read. In any event, this shows that even in Gregory the Great's day, and he reigned from AD 590 to AD 604, it was recognized that the Indian unicorn was a rhinoceros. And that's not all. Other people recognized it too. For example, if you read the Clementine Vulgate, it has the word rhinoceros in Job 39:9, where it says the Latin equivalent of, "Is the rhinoceros willing to serve you? Will he spend the night at your manger?" And the translators of the Catholic Douay-Rheims version use rhinoceros multiple times. The Protestant King James doesn't. It uses unicorn consistently, as the Douay-Rheims does in the Psalms. But outside the Psalms, the Douay-Rheims uses rhinoceros. So when the Septuagint referred to unicorns in the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Job, the Douay-Rheims uses rhinoceros in those passages. So we read things like, "God hath brought him out of Egypt, whose strength is like to the rhinoceros. His beauty is as of the firstling of a bullock, his horns as the horns of a rhinoceros. Shall the rhinoceros be willing to serve thee, or will he stay at thy crib? And canst thou bind the rhinoceros with thy thong to plow, or will he break clods of the valley after thee?" Now, I think that rhinoceros is a bad translation in this case. The Hebrew word ra'em doesn't mean rhinoceros. But what all this shows is that there was awareness, including among various Bible translators, that the Greek word monokeros referred to what we would think of as a rhinoceros.
As you've just said, one of those figures was Pope Gregory the Great, who reigned in the early Middle Ages, and one of the medieval legends was that you could use a virgin to capture a unicorn. This was allegedly because the unicorn would be attracted by the peaceful nature of virgins, and that they would become peaceful themselves, allowing them to be trapped by hunters. Is there anything that could have been the basis of this legend?
I'm at least aware of some proposals on this front, and the one I find most plausible is that it may be based on an earlier legend that is found, for example, in a work known as the Mahabharata, which is a work of epic literature in India. Chris Lavers summarizes,
"The Mahabharata is a long and rambling saga, about 200,000 lines, 10 times the length of Homer's Odyssey and Iliad combined. which tells the story of two closely related families of princes known as the Kauravas and the Pandavas. The corpus was probably written down in the form we have received it between 300 BC and 8300, though it harks back to a much earlier era. Family intrigue is the Mahabharata's main theme, but the narrative makes frequent detours, introducing folktales, hymns of praise to Vishnu and Shiva, and discussions of wider philosophical and religious matters. One of Mahabharata's folktales concerns a hermit named Rishya Shringa, also known as Gazellhorn. He lives deep in the forest with his father, an ascetic named Vibhadaka. Rishya Shringa is outwardly human, but he has a special endowment, a single horn on his head. Owing to familial connections with the gods, he also has the power to bring on the rains. The backdrop to Gazellhorn's tale is a drought in the land of Anga. The drought is King Lomapada's fault. He crossed a Brahmin priest and incurred the displeasure of the gods. In desperation, Lamapada consults his soothsayer, who divines that the only way to save the land and its people is to capture the rainmaker Gazellhorn. Lomapada, who as a king must have had significant resources of money and manpower, has no idea how to capture a young man living in a forest with his aged father. This incongruity tells us that we have yet to reach the important part of the story. Lomapada's daughter, Nalini, has an ingenious, if not circuitous, solution to her father's problem. She builds a floating hut out of leaves and sails down the river that runs through the forest where Gazellhorn lives. On arriving at his home, Nalini dresses in her best clothes, lets down her hair, and generally makes herself attractive. Then she goes ashore in search of her quarry. Suddenly the pair come face to face. Gazellhorn, who knows little of the world outside the forest, is smitten with the strange and exotic creature standing before him. The young pair spend some time together. Gazellhorn shows Nalini his hut, after which she retires to her boat so that he can wander off and develop the plot. That evening, Gazellhorn's father notices that his son is behaving strangely and warns him to beware of evil and corrupting influences. The next day, Gazellhorn sees Nalini and promptly forgets his father's advice. He climbs aboard the leafy boat where Nalini befuddles his brain by plying him with wine, a potent symbol of the agricultural, civilized outside world to which Nalini is leading her forest-dwelling primal force of nature. With Gazellhorn now fully under her spell, Nalini sails her boat out of the forest and back to the palace of the king. On the pair's arrival, the rain duly begins to fall, and Enga is saved. No doubt plants grow and the kingdom bursts with life again, just as one would expect of a land under the influence of a rainmaker with an obvious fertility symbol stuck on his head. Finally, the loose ends of the story are tied up. Vibhandaka is brought to the palace to witness the marriage of his son to Nalini. The betrothed go on to have lots of children, many of which have been unicorns like their father. Though the version of Mahabharata that we have received leaves this to the imagination.
So that's the basic story of Gazellhorn, who is himself a human unicorn who is only tamed by an unmarried woman, presumably a virgin. This doesn't mean that the Western story of virgins taming unicorns was taken directly from the Mahabharata. It likely wouldn't, but it's probable that both the Western story and the version in the Mahabharata are both based on an earlier story. Lavers writes,
while we should be suspicious of any connection between the modern unicorn and the contents of ancient folk tales, thousands of such stories have survived, so the occasional chance similarity is to be expected. Only a grave skeptic would dismiss the multiple parallels between the tale of the virgin and the unicorn and that of Nalini and Gazellhorn. In both we have an innocent one-horned creature, a force of nature, living at one with nature, who cannot be captured by conventional means. The only way to ensnare him is with the aid of a human female. The girl and the unicorn meet in the woods. She intoxicates him in one or more ways, captures his heart and loyalty, leads him to the palace of the king, and harnesses his supernatural powers for the salvation of the people. We do not know whether the story of Gazellhorn influenced Christian allegorizers, but it is difficult to avoid the suspicion that it or one of its relatives did.
And that may well be true. The Western story of capturing unicorns with virgins may be based on tales that were also common in India, such as the story of Gazellhorn.
Thus far, we've seen how different animals around the world could have become the basis for different unicorn accounts, and we saw how the virgin and the unicorn story may have originated. But at one point in Europe, they had physical evidence of unicorns. Specifically, they had the alicorns, or unicorn horns, that were very valuable and that were traded between royal houses and such. What can you tell us about those?
They were certainly real physical objects, not just legends or stories, and we still have them. Alicorns were popular during the Renaissance period, becoming known perhaps earlier than that, around the year 1200 maybe, and continuing in popularity through the 1700s. Wikipedia actually has a good summary of how valuable alicorns were at the time.
Seen as one of the most valuable assets that a person could possess, unicorn horns were given as diplomatic gifts, and chips and dust from them could be purchased at apothecaries as universal antidotes until the 18th century. Sections of horns were later displayed in cabinets of curiosities. The horn was used to create scepters and other royal objects, such as the unicorn throne of the Danish kings, the scepter and imperial crown of the Austrian Empire, and the scabbard and the hilt of the sword of Charles the Bold. The legendary unicorn could never be captured alive, but its symbolic association with virginity made it the symbol of innocence and the incarnation of God's word.
Churchmen also had alicorns. Reportedly, Pope Clement VII gave a 3-foot alicorn to King Francis I of France on the occasion of Francis's wedding to Clement's niece, Catherine de' Medici, to Francis's son Henry. And I've seen it reported that the Spanish Grand Inquisitor Torquemada carried alicorn with him to protect himself from poison, since one of the reported properties of the horn was protection from poison. But because they were owned by noble houses and high churchmen, what that means is we still have them. They're in museums and royal collections. For example, in the video version of the podcast, we'll have a photograph of 3 alicorns held in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, as well as a really long one that was given to the Roman Emperor Ferdinand I in 1540, which is currently in Vienna, Austria. So these are definitely physical objects. They look like big, long, twisty unicorn horns that we see in artwork. And when you see photographs of them, especially the one in Vienna, you get a really clear idea of what they are if you know your biology. Because as Europeans discovered in the 1500s, they really do belong to a one-horned animal. But it's not one that looks like a horse, a goat, or a rhino. Instead,
male narwhals can weigh nearly 2 tons. With bodies up to 16 feet long. But it's their tusks that make them weird among whales. The tusk is actually a single gigantic tooth that can reach 10 feet in length. But why swing such a big sword? Scientists aren't exactly sure. Narwhals are an animal of misinformation and mystery, dating back to the Middle Ages when their tusks were fobbed off to royalty as unicorn horns. Is it used to impale their prey? No. Narwhals can dive more than a half mile down to the ocean floor to feast on cod, squid, and cuttlefish. No stabbing or goring required. Is it used to poke around on that dark ocean floor? Possible, but improbable. Narwhals, like their dolphin cousins, use sonar to guide them through the depths. The tusk is jam-packed with nerve endings. Some scientists argue it acts as some kind of sensor. That would be one insightful incisor. But it's the males who predominantly sport the tusks. If the tusks had a survival advantage, the females would also be long in the tooth. Some scientists believe this means the tusk serves the same function as a deer's antlers or a teenager's hot rod, a way to show who's the fittest male around. Males occasionally cross swords. That's tickling the ivories. But whether it's a joust or a jaw session is anybody's guess.
So yeah, the European alicorns were actually narwhal horns, or more properly, tusks. Narwhals are a kind of smallish whale. They grow to between 11 and 18 feet long, and because their bodies are often speckled with gray, or often white, speckled with gray or black, they reminded sailors of corpses, and so they came to be called narwhals, which means corpse whale. They live in the Arctic Ocean, and they do indeed have a single long tooth that looks like a unicorn horn. So traders, cleverly, decided to sell these to rich Europeans as unicorn horns. And they weren't entirely lying, because narwhals are a kind of marine unicorn. But as Europeans began to figure out in the 1500s, the alicorns that were being circulated in Europe actually came from narwhals.
One of the things we covered earlier in this episode is how you can artificially make unicorns through horn manipulation, like Frederick Dove or Oberon Zell did. But that's a brute force method, and today we're beginning to do more subtle things like edit genes. Will it be possible to use genetic engineering to make true unicorns that can actually breed and pass down their single horn trait from one generation to another?
It may be possible in the future, depending on how good we get at gene editing, but I wouldn't expect it soon because there are significant challenges that would have to be met. SciShow explains.
For our purposes today, a unicorn is a horse-adjacent animal with one single horn or pointy appendage growing out of the front of its head. By horse-adjacent, I mean the ungulates, four-legged mammals divided into two main groups based on how their toes work. Horses belong to the odd-toed ungulates, or perissodactyls, but we're also going to include the even-toed ungulates, or artiodactyls, the group that includes stuff like deer and cows. And if that's all we need, guess what? We're done. We've got not one, but two animals that fit this particular bill. The first is almost definitely going to make some of you mad because it's narwhals. Hear me out. They're cetaceans which fall into our category of horse-adjacent. Cetaceans are a type of ungulate, and they're so closely related to artiodactyls that some researchers even mash the two names together and call the group cetartiodactyls. So, like it or not, narwhals totally count under our definition. If we want to look Mother Nature in the eye and ask her how to make a unicorn, we need to look at other animals that have evolved a lot more of the classic horsey unicorn traits, including anything bone or bone adjacent growing out of their heads. And there are no perissodactyls with any bony head ornaments. So to look at the evolution of unicorns, we have to make a quick hop to the next branch on the tree of life, back to artiodactyls. Specifically, we're looking at pecorans, which are things like deer, cows, and pronghorns. All of the animals that have evolved bony headgear fall into this category, so to study how to make horns on your head, they're the perfect animals to examine. Plus, there's a lot of old-timey illustrations of unicorns with deer-like cloven hooves, so we're pretty sure all pecoran headgear evolved from one common ancestor that had its own funky headset. Which means that the neat trick of growing these specific kinds of horns only evolved once. In evolution, something that happens once could happen again, but it's not super likely. Sorry, horses. But does this mean we can have our deericorn if two horns could somehow become one horn? A 2019 paper looked at how these guys' headgear forms and attributed them to neural crest cells, cells that migrate outward from the midline of an organism during embryonic development to create new structures. Headgear starting cells migrate to either side of the skull, towards the back of the brain case, and then become bony, sticky outy bits. And there are a few genetic changes specific to pecorans that make that happen, like some modifications to the gene OTOP3, which makes a protein associated with biomineralization, to make bone grow where it didn't used to. And some changes to the gene OLIG1, which is the one that tells those neural crest cells what to be and where to go. Finally, there's a bit of shuffling around some of those big boss genes of developmental biology. We're talking slug, twist, the Hox genes. See, while OLIG1 makes the neural crest cells move, these guys are the ones that make sure everybody's working together properly to make a lovely finished head bone. Taken together, you have a set of instructions that tell neural crest cells to go to either side of the head and build a brand new bony structure into very specific places. In order to get a deericorn, we'd need those genes to tell the neural crest cells to go to the front and center of the head, not onto the sides. And they'd have to form just one new bony protuberance, not two, meaning rewriting all those headgear gene changes. And you don't mess with genes like that lightly, because if you do interfere with the basic developmental program, odds are you just never get a grown-up organism that can pass those changes on. And to get a horsicorn, all that stuff that happened in pecorins would have to happen again in horses, which is a stretch.
So we won't be genetically modifying unicorns, at least not the ones that could pass down their single-horn status anytime soon, but maybe someday. But not until we have a much better understanding of how to manipulate the genes that govern the animal's developmental process in a way that doesn't cause major problems and in a way that is heritable by future generations. However, that doesn't mean we can't get unicorns by accident.
Italian researchers have discovered the legendary unicorn. The mythical beast with a single horn poking from the center of its head is alive and real, with one minor caveat. It's actually a 10-month-old deer with a genetic abnormality. Instead of the usual 2 antlers on the side of its head, this little fella has a uniquely single branch sticking out of its forehead. The discovery was made in a nature reserve in the Tuscan town of Prato, where injured wild animals are treated and, when possible, released back into the wild.
This deer was born in 2007 from a female who was brought to the park several years ago after being hit by a car. She gave birth to 2 male twins. We're very surprised to discover that one of the deer developed a unicorn.
Single-horned deer are rare, but according to Tazi, the central positioning of the horn is unique. Generally, the single horn is on one side, never at the center. A similar anomaly among deer might be at the origin of the unicorn myth, according to research.
Our deer shows that the unicorn is not just a fantasy that ancient people dreamed up. In past times, there could have been animals with this anomaly.
Named Unicorno, the deer lives in the reserve with his parents, twin brother, and 2 other deer. One more similarity he shares with his mythical namesake: his elusiveness.
We're studying his behavior. He is very shy with humans, but is totally accepted by the other deer. Under a social aspect, his anomaly shouldn't be a problem. The horns in these deers are only used to mark territory, not to fight, so he should be okay.
However, Unicorno is not likely to be released in the wild anytime soon. The next big day in his life, next February, he will shed his horn and regrow a new one. For Discovery News, I'm Jorge Ribas.
So yeah, you can have random mutations or other developmental issues that result in a natural unicorn, at least in species like deer that naturally grow horns. That video was from 2008, 16 years ago, so unfortunately Unicorno is probably no longer alive, since deer normally live for 3 to 6 years in the wild and very few live past 10 years old. Though there is a chance he might still be alive, since Unicorno was living in a protected area and deer have a maximum lifespan of 20 years. Unicorno probably wasn't able to pass on his single horn status to his offspring, though. At least that's what researchers thought at the time, and I haven't seen any references to him having done so. He also may not have become the leader in his group, since these deer don't attack each other with their horns and only use them to mark territory.
What about the speculation we heard that previous anomalies like this may have been the basis of unicorn stories?
Well, the wildlife expert we heard in the piece was an expert in wildlife, not in the history of unicorns. And as we've already heard, there are lots of other bases for the unicorn stories, including animals like bulls and goats that have had horn manipulation done on them, and animals that are naturally one-horned like Indian rhinos, and I think those are the real bases for the historic unicorn accounts. Although anomalous deer like Unicorno could play a small part in the development of unicorn stories.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line on unicorns?
Unicorns are real. They have very little to do with the fantasy unicorns that we see in art and literature today, but they are real creatures, and they go back thousands of years. While there may have been developmentally anomalous animals like unicorno, most would have been due to other causes, like animals that have received horn manipulation, such as the one-horn oxen we see in the seals of the Indus Valley civilization, the one-horned bull made by Frederick Dove, and the one-horned goats made by Oberon Zell and others. And then there are natural unicorns, like the Indian rhino, which was the basis of the description offered by Pliny the Elder and by others, like Pope Gregory the Great. There are even aquatic unicorns, like the narwhal, which gave Renaissance-era Europe its physical unicorn horns. And there's the elasmotherium, which was a Paleolithic or Mesolithic unicorn, perhaps. However, the Bible, that is the Hebrew version of the relevant books, does not mention unicorns. I'm sorry for skeptics, but it's actually referring to wild cattle and possibly aurochs, the progenitors of modern domesticated cattle, since it refers to them having two horns using the grammatical dual number. But despite all this, unicorns are real.
And so, Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the listeners and viewers on this?
We'll have links to Chris Laver's book, The Natural History of Unicorns, links to both volumes of St. Albert the Great's book on animals, St. Hildegard of Bingen's book, Physica, my own video on unicorns from 11 years ago, information about David Livingston, Henry Stanley, Harry Johnston, the Animal Logic video on okapis we heard last week, as well as historyofyesterday.com's piece on Oberon Zell, his patent for making unicorns, the Unicorn Keepers video channel, and specifically their video Real Unicorns, Discover Wildlife's article on backbred neo-aurochs, the Toronto Zoo's video on rhino vocalizations, information about alicorns and narwhals, as well as the SciShow video on unicorns and how to make them, Discovery News' 2008 video on the discovery of a deericorn, also a story from The Guardian on Unicorno, NBC News on Unicorno, and a song by the Irish Rovers called The Unicorn Song.
Yes, the famed unicorn song. I love that one. All right, so now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about unicorns and what Jimmy has revealed about them today? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say thanks to Rob Mady for his voiceover work, and also thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. You can see it at youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, please like, comment, and subscribe, because that's what helps the channel grow. I really appreciate your help in helping me grow my channel, so thank you.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be talking about deathbed visions. That is, visions that people have just before they die. And specifically, we're going to be talking about how research into deathbed visions began and what the first researchers learned about them.
Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where you should make sure to hit the bell to get notifications. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, or more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/317. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by Great Lakes Customs Law, helping importers and individuals with seizures, penalties, and compliance with U.S. customs matters throughout the United States. Visit GreatLakesCustomsLaw.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.
A long time ago when the earth was green and there was more kinds of animals than you'd ever seen, they'd run around free while the earth was being born, but the loveliest of them all was the unicorn. There was green alligators and long-necked geese, some humpty-backed camels and some chimpanzees, some cats and rats and elephants, but sure as you're born, the loveliest of all was the unicorn. Now God seen some sinning and it gave him pain, and he says, stand back, I'm going to make it rain. He says, hey brother Noah, I'll tell you what to do. Build me a floating zoo and take some of them green alligators and long-necked geese, some humpty-backed camels and some chimpanzees, some cats and rats and elephants, but sure as you're born, don't you forget my unicorn. Old Noah was there to answer the call. He finished up making the ark just as the rain started falling. He marched in the animals 2 by 2, and he called out as they went through, hey Lord, I got you green alligators and long-necked geese, some humpty-backed camels and some chimpanzees, some cats and rats and elephants, but Lord, I'm so forlorn, I just can't see no unicorn. Then Noah looked out through the driving rain. Them unicorns were hiding, playing silly games, kicking and splashing while the rain was pouring. Oh, them silly unicorns. There was green alligators and long-necked geese, some humpty-backed camels and some chimpanzees. Noah cried, close the door, 'cause the rain is pouring, and we just can't wait for no unicorn. The ark started moving, it drifted with the tide. Them unicorns looked up from the rocks and they cried, and the waters came down and sort of floated them away. And that's why you never seen a unicorn to this very day. You'll see green alligators and long-necked geese, some humpty-backed camels and some chimpanzees, some cats and rats and elephants, but sure as you're born, you're never gonna see no unicorn.